Okay, welcome everyone back to our second session on legal, business, environment, politics, economics, health in relation to indenture. A warm welcome to our speakers. We have 7 presenters, namely Anshu and Ashika Singh from the University of Fiji, Suvishna Singh and Sailesh Narayan, also University of Fiji. We have Manisha from the University of Fiji, Amba Pande from Jawaharlal University in India, David Pradhan and Ravinesh Prasad, University of Fiji, Henna Helvina from the Mahatma Gandhi Institute, and finally Satish Nan and Ravneet Reddy, University of Fiji. Just some quick ground rules before we begin. As usual, each speaker is allocated 15 minutes. I will issue an alert after 13 minutes, and I will step in to stop the session once the 15 minutes is up. The audience can send questions in the chat box, preferably with the name of the speakers that the question is primarily directed at. And you can also ask questions in person by pressing the virtual hand. Okay, so we are now ready to start, and the first speaker, according to my list, is Anshu and Ashika Singh. If you are present, you can start. You can start the proceedings now. Okay, it seems that they are not present. We'll go on to the next speaker. Suvishna Singh and Sailesh Narayan, are you in the room?
Yes, sir. Are you able to hear us, sir?
Excellent. I can hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. We'll begin. Nisambula, salam and namaste from Fiji Islands. Wishing peace and prosperity to our beloved island nation on its 51 years of independence. Happy Fiji Day to all, far and near, holding Fiji close to their hearts. I am Suvishna Subandana Singh from the University of Fiji, and the presentation today is a joint one with Mr. Sailesh Narayan, who is also from the university. The presentation focuses on the key question of how labor exploitation and migration affect women migrants' agency. As such, the attempt will be to answer the aforementioned question to the best of our understanding. Now, the history of migration is as old as the history of humanity. Humans since the very beginning have migrated to build a new, more promising existence elsewhere. Stephen Castles and Mark J. Miller, authors of a book titled The Age of Migration, write, and I quote, "Migration has become a private solution to a public problem," unquote. Migrants depart from their home countries as a result of political subjugation, warfare, or extreme levels of poverty. Migration, specifically labor migration, has become gradually more feminized. The astonishingly towering number of females migrating is the latest global movement. In the past, it was primarily men who migrated to countries far away. Women were merely followers. However, women too now migrate with the hopes of earning well and securing a blissful future, most of all for their families. The migration of women is not always a choice. Unfavorable state of affairs leaves many with no option but to leave behind the domestic sphere as caretakers and actively take charge as main providers. Many have developed into key single wage earners of their families. According to Saskia Sossen, a Dutch-American sociologist, and I quote, "This is the feminization of survival," unquote. Societies, states, and governments undeniably depend on the work of women in the labor force. However, the definition of the concept of feminization of migration has obtained a great deal of challenges over the past years. Having received many critics over these years has resulted in no one specific definition of it. Thus, the definitions exist as many as the critics. It is therefore crucial to delineate a fine line between the feminization of migration process and the feminized viewpoints on migration. Many migration researchers have defined the so-called feminization of migration as a contemporary phenomenon which depicts female migrants equating to or even exceeding the male ratio. Few other research scholars have defined feminization of migration in relation to the absolute growth in the visibility of women within the totality of international migrants relative to that of women within the past decades rather than men. Nevertheless, the growth has to be a significant one rather than minute so as to justify feminization of international migration. It needs to be comprehended that women have always been on the move, but their experiences had not been brought out from the shadow to achieve a more just environment for female migrants. Historically, migrants have been for long portrayed as male breadwinners by migration scholarships. The common understanding of a migrant back in the 19th and mid-20th centuries was a young male who dreamt of better opportunities. Simply said, feminization of migration scholars restricted the existence of women in researches to wives migrating with children as passive companions for spouses, fathers, and brothers. This neglected the imperative role of women as independent migrants. Despite the gaps in the early gender and migration studies, these studies to some extent managed to successfully bring the focus on women. Their role visibilities increased along with the issue of gender relations. As much as academic literature in the past wrote about migration, some of these works were far from female migration. Some narratives, for instance, represented migration as a liberating avenue which freed women from suffocating family control and unjust gender roles, especially when women became breadwinners abroad. Women, due to this, were seen as heroes, while on the other hand, female migrants were exhibited as unbearing victims of exploitation, prejudice, and mistreatment. Many of these migrants were and still are exposed to violence, whereby in a bulk of host countries, mainly the Middle East, domestic female workers have their passports seized on arrival and are forced to become entirely reliant on the employer. The situation aggravates to an extent whereby most of them are poorly paid or not even at all for the hard labor done, working 7 days a week until late nights, come rain or sunshine, and suffering serious brutality, which negatively progresses to rape and mental torture, becoming the ill fate of many women. These female migrants become caged prisoners in their psyches and have no means of escape. Moreover, they are plunged in the dark world of flesh trading, sent to neighboring countries to make prostitution not a part of life, but life itself. Furthermore, this results in forced pregnancies, serious bodily harm, and the spread of sexually transmitted infections amongst displaced migrant females. Dreams and hopes for a decent and well-deserved present and future are strangled by the chains of exploitation. Shelter of protection seems far from sight, and the journey is a long and difficult one away from the homeland and loved ones. Therefore, the risk of helplessness has extended beyond borders instead of being confined only within the four walls of the household. Now, I wish to give this time to my dear colleague Sailesh to move forward with our presentation. Thank you.
The feminist research argues that this vulnerability is gendered across men, gendered and affects men and women differently. Gender is a cross-cutting migration issue and perhaps one of the single most important factor shaping migratory experiences. Migrants are positioned differently within labor markets as the labor demand is often gendered according to economic sectors. It is vital to comprehend that gender specificities change over time and are significantly influenced by the migration experience. Thus, gender is a dynamic notion which not only defines the difference between men and women, but also points to how these differences are created, evolve, and play out throughout migration. Women migrant workers are exposed at numerous levels based on gender, race, color, and ethnicity, as stated by International Labour Organization. These levels have gone to a heightened degree, and since it is a matter of a human being, such discrepancies need to be eliminated so that every migrant worker, especially women, have the freedom to make choices accordingly. Now, being exposed to such factors will always put women migrants at risk, which will dampen their agency. The term agency needs to be comprehended with a clear conscience so that one can know how a woman feels when agencies are traded upon. The woman migrants agency theory, an account of their capacity for individualized choices and action, which basically entails a woman's ability to identify goals or make choices, and then act upon them, will for sure bring out many changes if followed. Women can exercise agency in many different ways as individuals and collectively within the family, and through their participation in markets, politics, and other formal and informal networks. Kabir states, and I would like to quote, that the agency stipulates and it can take a number of forms. For example, bargaining and negotiation, deception and manipulation, subversion and resistance, as well as intangible cognitive processes of reflection and analysis. Every woman as such should be in a position to practice their own rights so that they can get the best of the decision of becoming a migrant worker. But if they are not given the opportunity to succeed or freedom of choice, they will definitely crumble under the norms of the patriarchal society. Moreover, women have their own desires in social, cultural, and economical context, a democratic right of every individual. The longevity of their desire is to be as free as and recognized not only in the arena where they are working, but in all compartments as well. And as such, these elements need rigorous reviewing, which will allow women migrants contentment. The agency of a migrant woman plays a huge role in all the above spheres, and it can be viewed that there is a dire need for improvement. Ghosh has stated, and I quote, "Hiring and promoting talented women is the right thing to do for society. It is an economic imperative," unquote. Ghosh further states that gender should not be the barrier to hold back flourishment of migrant women workers, but clothe them with the privileges that they deserve. In addition, social context whereby many migrant women's agencies are buried by the overarching patriarchal norms, which is spread over every section of life in the world. The women migrants in numerous cases or scenarios are not given much freedom as the men. They tend to be concentrated in a more limited number of occupations that may in one way or the other restrict their movements or rather their freedom, limiting their opportunities to build networks or to access information and social support. Thus, the potential development contributions of women migrant workers are constrained by their heightened vulnerability to precarious employment with insufficient levels of social protection. The United Nations Women's Magazine states, and I would like to quote this, "Women migrant workers face a number of barriers to social protection and decent work, such as exclusionary policies which limit access to gender-responsive services, healthcare, or legal support for migrants, power imbalances between employer and employee, often enhanced by migration status-tied employment, isolation and lack of access to information on rights and protections, family separation and dependence on remittances, as well as sector-specific risks and language barriers," unquote. Also, in the cultural context, human communication occurs, which is whereby the most defining influence on human interaction. Culture provides the overall framework wherein humans learn to organize their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in relation to their environment. But if the migrant women are not given their right to promote their own culture, then their agency is again affected. Although people are born into a culture, it is not innate. It teaches one how to think, conditions one how to feel, and instructs one how to act, especially how to interact with others. In other words, how to communicate. The attributes of women migrants in the cultural context needs to be viewed because they surely will be having those rich cultural assets that may be beneficial to the organizations they are employed. Yet, the influence of culture on human interaction is paradoxical. As we conduct our daily lives, most of us are unaware of culture. However, for these migrant women, cultures also play an important role that need to be preserved. Furthermore, in the political context, which does not necessarily link to leadership roles, but how women migrant workers are mostly employed in low-skilled, low-paid, and informal sectors. Each of these three elements creates a triple jeopardy for women migrant workers, acting to further undervalue and undermine their work. The political context also highlights how women are exploited. Many employers do not lay the accurate rules, hide information, and manipulate these women to their advantage. It basically involves their entry and exit in contractual forms, and it in one way is a political notion. For example, women migrant workers typically command lower value than men in the workplace. Regardless of their sector or occupation, the work they do is typically undervalued because it is seen as women's work, and migrant workers can be competitively cheap and flexible, basically in relation to women migrant workers. It entails how women migrants employ their rights when within the parameters they are working in. In the case of agricultural and manufacturing sectors, notions around women are as docile, nimble, and obedient workers. They have contributed to the increasing presence as migrant workers, with employers trying to capitalize on the perceived advantages of migrant women's labor. These are in one way associated with the political context of women migrants' rights and freedom, which is systematically violated. Subsequently, economical context, where primarily every migrant worker moves from its place of origin to destinations in order to improve their quality of life, which include seeking higher wages, better employment opportunities, and a good standard of living. Juan Somavia, the Director General of International Labour Organization, states, and I quote, "Migrants are an asset to every country where they bring labor. Let us give them the dignity they deserve as human beings and the respect they deserve as workers," unquote. These migrant workers fill the immediate employment needs of any country and also often take less desirable positions only to earn a decent living. The presence of migrant workers means that more people are able to access goods and services, more money circulates in the economy, supply and the demand of that economy escalates. In the destination countries and territories, these migrant women are making a positive contribution to the health and well-being of others as they work in the care sector as well, often informally. They feel unmet needs for the long-term care in our aging societies. Social care systems in many countries as a kind of invisible subsidy. However, their own health is at stake. Are they able to access the services they need? If not, why not? And what can be done about it? What happens to the health and the care situation for the families that they leave behind to go to other countries to earn a living for them and also support their families back home? In addition, the Gurmit era women were exploited to the extreme by the overseers for the satisfaction of the lustful desires during the indenture system. Greedy eyes.
Excuse me, Sailesh. Sailesh, you got 2 more minutes.
Yes, sir, I'm concluding now. Inhumane thoughts and the arrogance of superiority, and above all, the intentions that made these overseers walk out plans to separate husbands and wives to get advantages over them. The women were tasked to work in areas far away from their husbands would work. During the day, these men of no humanity would go and abuse and even rape the woman. Such was the scenario during those days, and it is on a higher level at this time. To conclude the presentation, one can deduce that migration and labor exploitation has greatly affected the women migrants agency. It has damaged their regard of a woman in numerous ways, such as in social, cultural, political, and economical context. Their agency has been dented to a great degree as it was prevalent during the Girmit era, which gave the employers much leverage to jeopardize the lives of the women. Every migrant women's agency is important to ponder upon and make the appropriate changes to retain humanity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Feminization of migration is a really fascinating topic. And you have done a really good job in highlighting how vulnerable the women are, despite all the contribution they make, not only to their home country, but also to the host country, and how this is such a vulnerable group. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Well, but my PowerPoint is not with me, but can I give it orally, please?
Yes, that's what we want, just an oral overview of your presentation. That is suffice.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Helvina from Mauritius. I work at the Mahatma Gandhi Institute. My presentation is on, I'm sorry for the video. I think there's more problem, but I'll continue like this. My presentation today was on, the PowerPoint I prepared was on environmentally induced population displacement, a case study of Port Louis in Mauritius, an internship experience, that is how people were displaced at the time of, during the period of internship in Mauritius, that is from 1834 to about 1920s. And then at that time, the most common cause of population displacement were epidemics and tropical cyclones. This caused people to leave because of the poor sanitary conditions that prevailed in the capital city of Mauritius, that is Port Louis. So many people left the capital city to settle on sugar estates in other areas, in other parts of Mauritius. And other causes were also because they were looking for jobs. They found it more and more difficult to find jobs in the capital city. So they left in large numbers, and they left in large numbers to settle in other areas of Mauritius. It is important to note as well that even today, this mass displacement from the capital city is still taking place, because Port Louis, if we look at its geographical location, if we look at its topography, it is vulnerable to climate change. Port Louis is found along the coast. It is therefore at risk of flash floods, of a rise in sea level. It has even been reported that there has been a rise in sea level since the 1950s. Therefore, many people are still leaving Port Louis to settle in other areas of Mauritius. And in the PowerPoint presentation, when you're going to look at it, you'll see how epidemics, how tropical cyclones have caused a lot of destruction, a lot of damage to people and their belongings and their properties in Port Louis. So, and even today, climate change, we still need to investigate further how climate change is affecting the conditions, the living conditions of the people living in Port Louis. And we also need to investigate how what is the profile of the people living the capital city. This still needs to be investigated. So the methods used in this study were so a photo voice analysis and using climate data as well to see how the climate evolved over time, and how the climate has been changing since the mid-1830s, the mid-1830s until now, and using the experiences of the elders living in Port Louis, how they grew into resilient cities despite living in climate-stressed environments, because at that time they were very vulnerable to the epidemics. When we speak of epidemics, we speak of, at that time, cholera and malaria that happened. So cholera in the 1850s and malaria in the 1860s. And so you'll see the pictures of malarial control, and then later on people were affected by tropical cyclones. And at that time, tropical cyclones were not named. So we refer to the tropical cyclones by their year. And there have been tropical cyclones that mark the history in Mauritius. So people were greatly affected by these environmental hazards. So here it is. My presentation was mostly on how environmental hazards cause the people to leave the capital city of Mauritius. And it is also important to note that it is in the capital city. So we have the harbor in Port Louis, in the capital city. And this is the place where a huge numbers of indentured laborers disembarked. They reached the Port Louis, they settled at first, but then later on they had to move because of the poor sanitary conditions, the tropical cyclones, and it was difficult to find jobs. So my presentation was on that, the displacement of people from the capital city, and from the capital city, and they settled elsewhere. And this is still taking place today. Thank you.
Helvina, that was an excellent summary. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Climate change inducement, displacement is also a big problem in the Pacific region, and it's so interesting to get a grip of the situation in Trinidad.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is David Pradhan and Ravinesh Prasad, University of Fiji.
Good morning, everyone. This is an opportunity to present, for affording me this opportunity to present. I hope that I can be heard. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, David.
Yeah. The topic that we have written is on the legal geography of labor and climate change in Fiji. And this is about the effect, this is about the prevailing scenario in Fiji presently, and how it is pertinent, how the colonial rule is pertinent to it. So scientific studies indicate that the contemporary climate change and global warming caused by increased anthropogenic greenhouse emissions and changes in temperature and rainfall pattern are all due to human activities. The deleterious impacts of climate change are anticipated to be heterogeneous, multidimensional, but they're expected to be much more harsh on small island states, which face escalation of hazards of potentially devastating cyclones, groundwater salination, damage to geostructurally protective coral reefs, etc. And Fiji is one such small island state. The resultant socioeconomic political ramifications of these climate change-induced stresses on small island, and especially on labor, is analyzed in this paper of ours by taking into account the spatial and temporal geography of Fiji, which is an archipelagic state of more than 800 islands and islets with a population of less than 1 million. So constitutionally and legally, Fiji is unitary, egalitarian, multi-ethnic, multilingual, secular parliamentary democratic republic. But despite the legal structure, it presents a unique case of conflictual socio-political praxis, which is based on ethnic identity, which owes its origin to the colonial policy of large-scale transplantation of indentured labor from British India to Fiji. So the labor policies of the imperialist colonizer to the extent can be seen as the genesis of the definitive and determinative obstacles in the process of nation building in this small island state. And this article tries to analyze how the climate change is going to exacerbate those political differences. So to conceptualize the climate change hazards faced by Fiji and suggest structural mitigation strategies solely through the scientific, physical, geographical, and meteorological template would be reductionist, and therefore in situ geographical analysis of all the discrete identitarian communities and their spatial environment, as well as the interaction of social groups inter se, which is fundamentally reflexive to the history, economics, and normative values or laws accepted by the different communities, is necessary. So the transdisciplinary article based on secondary sources is delimited to geographically to Fiji, which is highly vulnerable to climate change. The labor law regime, labor rights, and prospects of securing employment and livelihood in the face of climate vulnerability are topically analyzed through the post-colonial approach by the contextualization of the politico-economic contestations within Fiji after independence, to the abrasive historical legacy of British colonialism, colonial indentured labor, and colonial policies promoting ethnicity as a political identitarian marker. The British colonial policy of disseminating indentured labor from British India to other crown colonies in the last quarter of the 19th century was incited by a meteorological El Nino phenomena. The lethality of the rare natural event was actually much magnified by the exploitative colonial policies favoring British capital in India, which invested in cash crops rather than fruit grains, severely affecting the food security of the population. The revenue misgovernance of the imperial British government in India, which derelicted any measures for irrigation while delegating the task to collecting onerous tasks from tenant farmers through the zamindari system, reduced the status of the tenant farmers with legal rights under customary law into mere serfs. And the government was also disinclined to provide any relief to the workers. It chose to translocate the famine-afflicted population as contractual indentured labor to other British crown colonies, where the British capitalists were facing a deficit of labor workforce. Contemporarily, the rising prices of cotton in the wake of American war and the strategic location of the Melanesian islands had prompted the British conquest of Fiji. The military conquest, the military subjugation of the indigenous people and annexation of the lands, while simultaneously permitting a weak puppet government of the indigenous chiefs headed by the Tuiviti to deal with the rebellious islanders, facilitated the establishment of plantation economy by the British in Fiji. By 1874, the British had gained complete control over the islands and secured the cessation of sovereignty by the nominal ruler, who was allowed by the British to exercise customary authority over indigenous community in a form of indirect delegated rule. However, the very next year, in 1875 and 76, an epidemic of measles, most likely introduced by the spread of by the blackbirding slaver vessels, wiped out a third of the entire population of Fijians. Most of the fatalities were able-bodied youth in the plantations. The effect of this was devastating for the indigenous natives of Fiji, and its repercussions were so severe that the cotton plantation economy of Fiji collapsed and was replaced by the sugarcane plantations. In 1878, the first batch of indentured laborers from India departed for Fiji in Leonidas, and this continued till 1916. And this led to the settlement of a significant Indo-Fijian community in Fiji. So after Fiji gained independence as a dominion of the Commonwealth in 1970 and declared itself a republic in 1987, the control of land resources has emerged as the crux of political power and economy in post-colonial Fiji. This is a legacy of the colonial land tenure again, when the British maneuvered the succession to the British crown by the internecine feuding indigenous chiefs of the island in 1874, the peaceful transfer of sovereignty was achieved by the British governor Sir Arthur Gordon's assurances to the native chiefs that their heritage, land, and customs would be unassailed and acknowledged by the British suzerain. The legal deed of secession, which was signed by the indigenous chiefs in Article 4, asserts the eminent domain of the British Crown over all lands. But Article 7 acknowledges that the British Crown recognizes the rights and interests of the indigenous natives in consistency with British sovereignty and the colonial governance of Fiji. This political historical document has attained salience in the post-independence politics of Fiji as it is interpreted by the indigenous Fijians as a charter acknowledging the protection and prioritization of the interests of the community as a founding principle of the Fijian statehood. This is contested by the minority ethnicities who assert that constitutionally and legally all citizens are equal in Fiji in rights and view the constitutionally and legally ratified protection of the vested and heritable legal rights of the indigenous communities as exclusionary towards non-indigenous minority communities, privileging discriminatory hierarchization. The influx of Indian indentured labor in 1879 created demands to secure the rights to land ownership by the indigenous community, and by the Native Lands Ordinance number 21 of 1880, recognition was granted to customary and hereditary rights of the indigenous communities of land, which prohibited sale of land and asserted inalienability of lands from the corporate body of right holders. This was further statutorily consolidated in the Aitukai Lands Act of 1905, within which the eminent within the eminent domain of the British Crown in Section 3 defines Aitukai land to be land held according to customary laws. This is the land, the rights in which are vested in a discrete and determinate social unit of the indigenous community. So Section 5 of the Act also provides that Aitukai land cannot be sold, mortgaged, gifted, transferred, or any way be subject to encumbrances. This in effect means that personal ownership of Aitukai land by a member of the indigenous communities is a misnomer, since what is individually possessed is an inalienable, heritable, but leasable right in the customarily determined apportionment in favor of the community. Section 13(1) of the Fisheries Act 1985 protects the exclusive indigenous customary fishing rights in freshwaters by criminalizing any trespass or fishing without leave and license from the community. These rights were granted constitutional inviolability by Article 185-26 of the Constitution of Fiji 1997, which has also been continued in Article 28 and 29 of the Constitution of Fiji 2013. So despite the legal and constitutional provisions to secure the land ownership rights, the economic lot of the indigenous community of Fiji has been precarious. And in fact, this year, the statistics suggest that it is even worse compared to the minority ethnicities, especially the Indo-Fijians, most of whom are engaged in mercantile pursuits, or the employees of the leasing corporations to whom the indigenous lease their land. So this paradoxical discrepancy is also the result of colonial policy of ethnically seclusionary labor differentiation between the indigenous natives and the indentured laborers, which has been identified as a classic example of colonial racial politics of divide and rule. While the indentured laborers were historically channelized towards plantation labor, mining, small-scale commercial business, the indigenous communities were purposefully cloistered from the organized labor sector and confined to traditional livelihood from customary owned land and water access, and later allowed access to service in the colonial military and civil services. This structural disparity in history in access to gainful employment and economic progress on one hand, and vested ownership rights on land resources but without significant economic recompense on the other in Fiji, engenders an asymmetry of economic and socio-political power that are ethnically pivoted. So ethnic, political conflict and political instability marked by military coup, because the Fijian military or the Fijian armed forces are almost exclusively manned by Fijians of indigenous descent, has repeatedly marred the democracy of Fiji since independence. So after an analysis of the constitutional provisions regarding these, we come down to the effect that climate change is anticipated to have on Fiji. So Fiji is impact of climate change on Fiji will be complex. Will be a complex of several interactions of geophysical, meteorological, and human ecological factors, the exact contours of which are difficult to accurately predict. Fiji is especially vulnerable to changes in weather, cyclones, sea level rise, storm surges, rising tides, damage to mangroves and coral reefs, fluctuation in precipitation and temperature, salination of groundwater and freshwater, and drought. For an example, the devastation wrought by the Winston cyclone of 2016 is an indicator of the scale of damage that can occur. So as we see it, food insecurity, sustainability, and agriculture in Fiji is expected to suffer to a great deal. Now, this is very important in a state where almost 70% of the population is dependent on agriculture as a source of income, while almost 85% of the land holding is held by one community. So this is seen as a source of conflict that can arise in the future. Now, there has been some laws. There have been some laws presently which have been enacted, like the Employment Relations Amendment Act 2020, which has defined acts of God and has tried to mitigate to a certain extent. However, it remains to be seen that unless there is critical engagement linking the economy, environment, and society, and the exclusionary nature of the social and legal structure of Fiji is changed, climate change will have a sure impact, which will weaken the intrastate, intergenerational, and socioeconomic equity. So this is just the broad outline. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. That was a very in-depth presentation addressing a multitude of really complex and trends and cross-cutting issues. Thank you, David. So we have our next speaker who is ready, and she is Ashika Singh. Ashika, you may start your presentation.
Thank you, sir. I hope I'm clear and all of you are able to hear me. Greetings, everyone. Bola, namaste, and namaskaram. Happy Fiji Day to all. And I am Ashika Singh from the University of Fiji. I am grateful to be part of this conference, and for some reasons, my partner Anshu Lal is not here. So I will present on behalf. I will give the summary of my presentation because it is not worth to touch on the presentation that I have already recorded. My topic today is on the impact of migration on migrant women and girls, that is a gender perspective. As we all are aware that our ancestors did play a great role in the succession of the sugarcane plantation and its industry. This task of progression was not that easy while they encountered many challenges, struggles, and mishaps. Till today, the memories of our great-grandparents are alive through some of the Fijian writers like Professor Satyendranan, Professor Subramani, and Jaginder Singh Kanwal. Women, they play an important role in the lives of people, country, and to its economy, but are still the victims of sexual abuse, rape, oppression, and also domestic violence, which is not present today, but was also experienced by the women during endangered system. Between 1879 and 1916, some 60,537 Indians arrived in Fiji as indentured laborers. Among these migrants were Hindus who were from a variety of castes. There were also Muslims, Christians, Punjabis, and South Indian. Men, especially the young, were brought to work on the sugarcane plantation since they were believed to be strong compared to the older ones. While the reasons for women migration to Fiji one needs to consider is general. Migrant women comprise half of the total migrant population in the world and provides important social and economic contribution to their countries of origin and destination. Migrant women and girls are uniquely and disproportionately affected by gender-based discrimination, abuse, and violence. This presentation will focus on the impact of migration on migrant women and girls during indenture and at present. So women migrants are constantly entering and leaving those bedded societies, which explains why gender relations and issues are constantly changing. International human rights framework governing gender and migration states that all human beings are entitled to all human rights, especially for women. There is no hierarchy of human rights, as all rights are universal, interdependent, and of equal importance. Women migrate for similar reasons, such as the desire to receive a better education, to find work, to improve the quality of life for themselves and their families, and to reunite with their family members. However, indenture migration can also be caused by pressure, such as the need to flee conflict and maltreatment, or economic instability, which most of our indentured women, they suffered. Giving women gender economic empowerment means enabling women to increase their right to economic reasons and their control over meaningful decisions that benefit themselves, their households, and their communities. These include the right to control their own time, their income, and access to participation in existing markets equally. Greater empowerment improves their well-being and economic status, thus gender inequality remains an issue in the Pacific Islands like Fiji. Much of the gender inequality in developing countries is caused by the prevalence of cultural norms that intensify favoritism towards males, which is also very true at the moment and at present in Fiji and other countries. Moreover, the sufferings of women and girls during indenture until date remains the same. During the indenture system, and according to Professor Subramani, the ratio of men to women was not a great concern. However, when indenture began, the ratio of men to women was 100 to 3. And so this gender disparity led to a shockingly high level of social ills on the plantations, as men competed for women mainly from their own ethnic background. On one hand, it is argued that the experience of Indian women during indenture was slightly different from slavery. Some definitely were the victims of deceitful recruiting practices by the Harkatis. These were the recruiters, but others were in search of better opportunities. Many, they did not imagine a permanent separation, hoping to return one day, but time passed, memories of India faded, and the day of decision never came. It was difficult trying to convince women to travel out of India, mainly because of traditional customs and the uncertainty of the entire indenture scheme. However, their gender disparity, caste, religious backgrounds, and low social status before arrival hindered efforts towards organization. They arrived as indentured workers with no voice or will of their own and remained more or less the same during their break. Within and beyond their plantation world, women had little choice but to carry the double burden of balancing low-wage labor, work, and household duties and expectations. To add on, whenever they failed to meet expectations, they were abused and even murdered. Women were caught between the European and Indian patriarchy and were often sexually abused or vulnerable to advances made to them from their immediate European and Indian supervisors. Indian women were paid lower wages than men, and married women's wages went into the bank accounts of their husband. For example, Joginder Singh Kanwal, who has written The Morning translated as Savera in Hindi version, he has clearly discussed the treatment of women during indenture system. The use of characters of Shanti and Jamuna in his novel has brought tears to my eyes when the women were whipped and abused. This shows our ancestors had suffered in a greater amount. However, death rates of Indian women were much higher than those of men. Deaths were caused by murder, suicide, and childbirth. They suffered as a result. Many young women committed suicide. So far from their homeland, in the loneliness of distant islands, their life acquired value, even if the price was high. Moreover, name calling was also a treatment. Nobody wants to be called a dog, but they were called coolies in the eyes of colonial world. Beasts of burden, but some suffered more than others. Women bore the burden of racism as well as sexism. They were held accountable for the two most obstinate problems of indenture. One was the heart-rending high infant mortality rates, especially in the 1890s, when nearly a quarter of the children could die within the first year of birth. Officials laid the blame for this at the feet of Indian mothers who allegedly lacked the motherly instinct, due in part to their loose morals and poor hygiene. Few attributed the tragedy of plantation work and the routine itself, the absence of child-rearing facilities on the state lines, the compulsion on women to return to back-breaking field work soon after birth, the prevalence of devastating infectious diseases such as hookworm, diarrhea, dysentery, and anemia, to which many mothers and children included capitulated in disastrous numbers. Their daily routine began at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. with preparation for work, and frequently one returned to one's room in the afternoon, more often late than early. Work was hard and energy was sapped, not only by such toil, but also through debilitating illness, poor and insufficient food, and inadequate sanitation. To further highlight on, not only the women had to work on the sugarcane field, but also had to cook for the family, look after the children, get the barrack organized, even though they were sick and tired. The other major problem afflicting the Indian indentured population was suicide. Suicide was not a major killer, but because of its tragic and sensational nature, violent and unnatural, it attracted public attention. And Fiji Indians at the turn of the 20th century had the highest suicide rate among all Indian laborers importing colonies. For this tragedy, too, women bore the major blame. Sexual jealousy was the catch-all phrase used to explain the cause of death. There was sexual disparity in the recruited population, with a stipulated 40 women migrating to every 100 men. The ratio had been in place since the 1870s and was invariably met in Fiji's case. But while the recruitment of women alleviated the disparity somewhat, it did not solve it. Moreover, women's privacy was not paramount. While on Girmit, the laborers found themselves housed in a room 10 feet by 7 feet, or after 1908, 10 feet by 12 feet in a barrack of 16 rooms, 8 on each side. Sometimes a room housed either 3 single persons or a married couple with not more than 2 children. The rooms had doors, but not windows. And sometimes no floors. The partitions did not reach the ceiling. There was instead a wire netting link for ventilation. The room was a storehouse, kitchen, a living room, and bedroom. It was the place where a laborer spent his life when not outdoors. One's privacy was in inverse proportion to one's neighbor's curiosity. Sometimes married couples lived in rooms adjacent to single men. Women were not privileged of having sexual privacy and self-privacy. In addition, the collapse of culture and custom among the immigrants and the filthy living conditions in the lines had the morals of the poultry yard. The Hindu women in this country were like an aimless vessel with its mast broken, being wheeled down the rapids of a great river without any controlling hand. She passes from one man to another and has lost even the sense of shame in doing so. This portrayal was as harsh as it was unfair, but truth, in the objective sense, was not a part of the purpose. If women had to be demonized to arouse the conscience of India, then the practice had to be paid by the victims. This is one of the saddest legacies of the anti-indenture struggle in Fiji and elsewhere. Once again, the treatment of women, especially their sexual exploitation by European overseers and Indian sardars, too played a critical role in awakening the Indian conscience towards the violence committed in Fiji and other sugar colonies. This behavior and treatment is an indication that women as indentured laborers had no right. As we compare the present situation of today, it is more or less the same. Since rape, sexual abuse, oppression do still exist in today's society. The consequences faced during indenture and at present is still the same. Till to date, women also work on the farms, not only sugarcane, but also vegetable farms. While working on the farms, they also perform all the household chores, look after children without any support from others. The treatment of women was very harsh during the indenture and is still kept alive by some of our Fijian writers, as well as it is passed from one generation to the other. Thank you all for listening, and once again, happy Fiji Day.
Okay, so there was yet another presentation on the entrenched huge problems in female migration and how there's so much work that still needs to be done. Ashika Singh was our final speaker for this session. What we'll do now is open it up for a few questions, if there are any. So I invite audience members to ask any questions. You can do it by raising your palm or send questions in the chat forum. Okay, maybe I'll just start off things with a question for Ashika, Sailesh, and Suvishna. And then the question is, how can female migrants receive better protection? Besides the host country, are the home country governments doing enough on their end, such as due diligence and appropriate legislation? So maybe we can start with, we'll start with Suvishna, Sailesh, and then Ashika.
All right, sir, thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, sir. As we mentioned in our paper that these women migrants who move to other countries in order for better opportunities, they do face difficulties. They do face difficulties as mentioned, but then it goes back to everything. Everything starts from home, as we say. And then I feel that it is within the four corners of the households that they should be given the freedom. Just as we teach moral values to children, my belief is that in the same manner as a family, men and women and children even should sit down together. And, we should talk about the rights along with responsibilities of everybody. Not only about the duties that one is expected to perform, but also the rights, which a child will have in the house or a woman of the house will have, along with the man making decisions also. So collectively, the woman should be given a position in her household, first of all, before going into the outer sphere. It's the inner sphere, which it all starts, the domestic sphere within her household. So if priorities are set right within that sphere, first of all, then when she goes out in the real world, which is harsh, no doubt, because there are many people out there with different mindsets. But if a woman knows where she stands, her position is, and what she's supposed to be saying, when asked, then when going out into the outer sphere, she will not have any problem. She will not start questioning that what is my role, what is my responsibility as a woman, and what are my rights and responsibilities. So my belief is that it should start within the home sphere, the inner sphere, and then into a country, the government and other important organizations should also be equally responsible. It's no point if we just protest or just speak about women's rights and everything, providing security for them and all, if we are unable to actually do anything for them. Because as it is rightfully said, actions speak louder than words. So whatever we say, we should actually put that into action, and only then we can bring about empowerment, because women agency is related with empowerment. We can only affect a woman's agency positively if we bring about empowerment, and then they are given choices, whether what they want to choose, something which matters greatly to them or something which has very little or no value at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Suvishna. We can hear next from Sailesh, if he wants to contribute.
Yes, I surely want to contribute to this.
Let's keep our answers short and to the point.
Yes. Yes, echoing the sentiments of what Ms. Suvishna has just said, that the freedom, the right, the knowledge, the empowerment actually begins within the four walls of the house. It is from that and from only from that the importance of a girl, a woman is shown to the world. Now we cannot always embark on all these things once it blows out of proportion. We need to contain all these mindset within, and then once the girls and the women, if they prefer to move abroad or migrate and start working in a different country, then only then they will be able to adjust to the situations, and along with that they will have the will and the understanding to look at the various points. For example, as mentioned in our text, that their agencies are affected in the context of many compartments, such as political, social, and all. So once we begin it from home, then these things are taught accordingly, and it is taken to the next step when they enter into the school system. And from there, then we have a lot of bodies, NGOs who are doing promotions, who are giving information for women's rights and all these that are aligned with women. So basically what I would like to drill with this at this point is that the understanding of a girl and the woman would only be broadened if they are given all those values, and most importantly, the freedom and what their rights actually are in the society. And also that will give them that empowerment to stand up for themselves. Now, this is normally not happening in most of the countries where they go and work, whereby a lot of rules and regulations are manipulated as far as the women migrants are concerned. So this can be put to a halt if it all begins from home and it escalates to schools and then the secondaries, and then once they go into the workforce with all those knowledge of their own rights. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay.
Just a very quick response.
Okay. I totally agree with what Suvishna and Sailesh has just said, that everything, it actually begins from home, and the respect for women, it is actually taught at home. And the other thing I would like to add on is to break the culture of silence. Like there are many cases like that is being reported, not reported. And because our culture is such that we actually do not give more value on that. And to add on what Sailesh has said, that not in all the countries, women are neglected or are not given the rights. So I do agree with that. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No, we just wonder how much the home country is doing for these women, because these women work abroad and they send money back home, quite a significant amount in remittances. So what is the home country doing for them in return in terms of their protection? But that's maybe another discussion. We'll now allow Ramsamy Celine. She's got a question. Go ahead.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, and good morning to everybody. I just want to know and to ask to Suvishna Singh, just to tell her in the first that her presentation that I took earlier on was very interesting, because I think that the situation in Reunion Island for indentured women was quite the same. And I think that it's very interesting to take care about the complexity of the situation of the woman during indenture, because of course they had to face a lot of aggression, but I think that they managed to find a way to get a kind of freedom. And I wanted to ask Suvishna, what about the archive, and could she get the document about the aggression of the woman, and what about the document? documentation in Fiji? So it was for Suvishna.
Suvishna, a quick response from you, please, to Ramsay Celine's question. I think she's after some documents. Suvishna, are you still around? Looks like she might not be.
Yes, oh, yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Yes.
Yes, madam. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, madam.
Might have missed your question. You can just quickly repeat your
I told that I just said that your presentation was very interesting because the situation for women in danger was quite the same in Reunion Island, but we have also to be careful about the complexity of this social situation because whoever they were very in a bad situation and had to face a lot of aggression. And they were very lonely beyond among all the men. I wanted to know what about the archive in Fiji, and could you get access to the documentation relating about the aggression and sexual abuse against women?
Women in the Girmit era, is it, madam, you're asking?
Sorry?
Is it about women in the Girmit era?
Yes, Girmit era.
Yes, we surely can get access because many stories, many books have been written actually talking about the mistreatment of women in the Girmit era. And even as mentioned by my colleague, Mr. Sailesh, in his presentation about the experiences of Girmit women. So what I'm saying is that, it started in the Girmit era, and as much as we may have progressed now in this contemporary world, there does exist mistreatment of women. I'm not saying that I am a feminist or anything. I'm not saying anything as such. But what I'm saying is that we will find instances of women being mistreated. It's not completely clean and clear. We surely have. And yes, we will be able to find evidence as you have asked, madam.
Okay. Thank you, Suvishna.
Thank you,
which brings me, your comments brings me to an observation by Dr. Ganesh Chand, who's the conference convener. And let me read out what he has sent to us in the message. He says that evidences from Suriname show that women were more empowered within the household during the indenture era than they became 30, 50 years after indenture. Could this also be correct for Fiji, Trinidad, Mauritius, and Reunion Islands? I'm not sure if we are in a position to address this question, but it seems like an interesting observation that perhaps needs more research.
Research, yes, sir. Totally agree with you. It would be interesting to research.
Some research has been done, and there's anecdotal evidence to show that women's situation has not improved much. It might even have worsened. Okay, so I believe that brings our very interesting session to an end. Unless someone wants to make a last final comment.
Oh, yeah, thank you, sir. Suvishna, thank you for this wonderful presentation. And
thank you, sir.
Kerala also experienced this kind of migration from India to, and it's interesting to see that the migration to the Gulf is predominantly male migrants and who are directly involved in the labor force, manual labor force. At the same time, women are also there. They also took part, but they faced an extreme form of discrimination, exploitation, and all of sorts that you have. But at the very same time, we have a very strong outflow of women migrants to other countries, and even including the GCC countries where they faced such kind of experiences. But the critical point here is education and professional qualifications, proficiency that makes differences, because it's the people who stay at the lower levels they face. So, and now the labor market is changing, evolving, and they require more professionally qualified people ever than before. So the cases of instances also coming down, and the people from India, the Kerala especially, because Kerala state in India alone supplies the largest portion of health professionals across the globe. Everywhere you can see a Malayali health professional, especially a nurse and paramedical. Also, there are many doctors and all these people. But anyway, it's a feminized way of labor force from Kerala, who have almost have a complete dominance over the sector. And they don't face such kind of, and not only that, the education sector in Kerala also evolved according to the increasing need. That's to cater to the increasing need of the labor force that is required across the globe. So we have a lot of paramedical institutions that train nurses. And in some time, my primary inquiry showed that from Cochin International Airport, and many times there's chartered flights carrying maybe 200, 300 nurses in a single flight from Kerala to maybe Canada and all these places. So education is a critical variable that decides the not just in the case of females, but even in the case of males. And it is widely reflected in films and literature. This is very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So can you all see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here. It's really a pleasure for me to be part of this conference. In fact, I started my journey in the diaspora, studies on diaspora with Fiji. So I have a special connection with it. And I'm really glad that I could, overcome this technical glitches and be part of this. So my topic, as you can see, is indentured women and discourses in India. So I thought, it is a commonly discussed topic, but what was happening in India, how people were looking at this subject in India at that time and even later on. So that's what I thought I would present. So I have, so I have 3 publications, on this women in Indian diaspora. But basically, I just showed the book just for your, information. But let me start my presentation. In the recent years, as the indenture system has caught the attention of the academia and the practitioners alike, it has resulted in some in-depth inquiries, busting the existing myths and narratives on the subject. Indentured women are also one of the critical themes which is being explored through multidisciplinary approach. In this presentation, I aim at discussing one of the less explored facets of indentured women, and that is the prevailing discourses in India on them. I argue that the general protectionist attitude dominated the discourse in India, and indentured women were either projected as exploited, powerless victims or as morally degraded beings who were the cause behind many of the evils that existed on the plantations. Within these dominant narratives, the real challenges and problems faced by the indentured women were completely sidelined and their voice is completely silenced. It is a known fact that British prescribed for 40 women per 100 men to be transported with every batch. We are also well aware that several illegal, unscrupulous methods were adopted by the recruiters. But studies also point out that many women got recruited voluntarily. However, I will not deliberate on this subject further because that's not the focus of this presentation. The scarcity of women was believed to be one of the major sources of exploitation that the women faced in the colonies, and it was a matter of great concern in India. That's how it was perceived in India, that the major problem is the scarcity of women, and the other major concern was regarding the recruitment of single women, which was considered almost outrageous, branding them as kind of destitute women, you know, belonging to a particular kind of profession. So the issue of indentured women gripped the minds and media in India and became part of the national movement quite early. The moving story of Kunti and many other indentured women who were facing rape and abuse at the plantations created a furor all over India. Moreover, various stories of the so-called highly immoral lives the Indian women were forced to lead or were voluntarily leading in the colonies also poured in, threatening the prevailing notions of order and civility. As Ashwani Tambe has written, the attack on the chastity of India's own women was like a challenge to its honor. The morality issue of Indian coolie women in overseas colonies of the British Empire were Gandhi's initial motivation to assemble Indian nationalists against the colonial government. Brijlal also has written about this, and he states that the move to stop the degradation of Indian women in the colonies attracted more support among the Indian masses than any other issue. According to Charu Gupta, the issue of indentured women was put in the context of larger debate on gendered morality, belonging, and what is good and what is bad for these women, and, you know, with metaphors like Sita and things like that. Another scholar says that, you know, women and honor were like convenient symbols for the early nationalists to gather support against the colonial power. Periodicals and dailies like Sri Darpan and New India gave extensive coverage to the issue and mobilized public opinion to a great extent. Annie Besant wrote, she was the editor of New India, and she wrote that self-respect of India was hurt by this refined and civilized form of slavery. Thus, as it appears, women's body and character became the battleground and a matter of Indian honor, which was being ruined in the hands of the British. On the other hand, finding themselves to be on the back foot and unwilling to admit that the evils were caused by the conditions of indenture, colonial officials resorted to explanations like Indian cultural traits, like, you know, very possessive and violent men, etc., or the type of women. You know, they also said that, within quotes, type of women being recruited, or male and female ratio were some of the causes as the British interpreted. So the whole frame within which indentured women's discourse was deliberated either objectified them as victims of multiple forms of violence or as fallen immoral beings. These two strands were in fact the same two sides of the same coin. The first remained stuck with the narrative of exploitation, subjugation, and other within the frame of patriarchal frame of purity, morality, and honor, you know. Therefore, the indentured women stood accused in the eyes of both the nationalists as well as the colonialists. Both these narratives presented women in a fixed, objectified category rather than as exploited workers. The attention on such issues deviated the discourse from the real problems and the miserable conditions in which women were living and working at the plantations. Several scholars have presented elaborate research on the wretched conditions on the plantation and how these women were exposed to several kinds of exploitation because of that. It would be relevant here to see how the other issues of women were being dealt in the 19th and 20th century India. With regard to reformatory laws on age of consent and abortion or divorce, these laws were being debated at that time. You know, the British actually were trying to put some kind of uniform criminal code and civil code. But the civil code was very sensitive, was a very sensitive matter, and that they had realized in the case of sati, because you know a lot of resentment was there in that time, you know, during that time in India. So all these laws were being discussed at that time, but it was largely led by men, be it the colonial administrators, liberal reformers, or the conservative Indian elite. The only women's voice was the Western British feminists, who were more interested in, within quotes, civilized, you know, civilizing. The civilizing word is within quotes, or training the Indian women whom they regarded as weak individuals with no agency or as morally loose beings, along the lines of Victorian feminist notions of womanhood. In addition to these women, the elite women of Indian society, who were actually also writing and speaking on indentured women, they were also giving their opinions about other laws of women. They themselves were, you know, trained in largely trained in the Western feminist thought processes or orthodox Brahmanical beliefs, and were more concerned about correcting the wrongdoings of indentured women. Otherwise, the pluralist Indian practices prevalent at that time, it's not prevent, I'm sorry, it's prevalent at that time, did allow to some extent divorce, second marriage, widow remarriage, and several other things for which the indentured women were being blamed, but it was also prevailing in India. Please excuse me, this is not prevent, this is prevalent. This was the scenario, you know, and what was more conspicuous was that the fact that complete silence of indentured women on the issues related to them. They never got a platform to speak or express their opinion, were never consulted on any matter since they were unable to read and write. Their histories remained silent. Though the system and the process was under great scrutiny, yet the indentured women themselves, their own concerns and their voices remained completely marginalized. So the Indian discourse remained within the patriarchal parameters of powerless victims or immoral women. This largely, but not totally, overlooked the real challenges that were faced by the indentured women during the journey and at the plantations. There was less or almost no talk on resolving the issues of very low wages, inhuman living conditions, lack of privacy, physical protection, and from protection from abusive partners or drunk menfolk, or so many other problems. There was hardly any concern to ensure her wages ration during her absence from work due to sickness or childcare, or any kind of compensation in case of broken marriages, etc. So no one was there to speak from her side. In this whole conversation, what these women lost the most was the respect and honor in the Indian minds and media. However, as the deeper research and interest on women-centric studies got within the larger domain of indentured studies became prevalent, different perspectives started coming up. It challenged the stereotypical objectified images of indentured women and explored the multi-layered dimensions of their agency in the social, cultural, economic, and political formations of the plantation lives. Women scholars like Peggy Mohan, Ramabai, Gaitura Bahadur, through their writings have reinstated the indentured women to their stature. It reinvented the histories from their own perspective and punctured the myth of voiceless victims or recasted object to bring out a worker who negotiated with the patriarchal norms and exploited conditions to create a niche for herself. Numerous aspects of indenture life have come to the fore and are being discussed in India also. This, however, this, however, is less in India than the diasporic countries, it is less in India. So, but there are studies coming up also. But unfortunately, a similar kind of protectionist attitude still prevails in India, where protection rather than the empowerment of women migrants is the major concern. Thank you. That was my presentation.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation, which ended on a really strong note in terms of not just protecting women, but perhaps more importantly, empowering them.
Yeah.
So with that, I open the floor for questions, if any. Seems like there are no questions. So we will call this session to an end. We saw some really interesting papers on a very important aspect of migration and indenture, and that is the oppression of female migrants, which is continuing to this day. Thank you so much, and I'll be back at 12 a.m. for our next session.